What is sixth generation warfare? What's going on, people? My name is Zulfikar and welcome to my YouTube channel, which is about equipping you with the tools you need to go to war with yourself and a society fighting to keep you weak. I talk about self-improvement in the fields of mind, body and soul to help you overcome the conditioning and programming of this degenerate society we find ourselves in today, so that you can fashion for yourselves a life full of direction, meaning, purpose and spiritual consciousness. If you are aligned with that message, go ahead and click the subscribe button so you get more content on these things. Back to the topic of conversation today, which is about the different generations of warfare and specifically sixth generation warfare. First generation, this is where wars are fought in a line and column tactic with uniformed soldiers governed by the state. What you have here is predominantly massed manpower battles. Second generation warfare. Here you have the invention of rifles and breech-loading weapons. There was also the development of machine guns and indirect artillery fire. This is where you have smaller units of men manoeuvring separately. There's use of trench warfare, artillery, camouflage and radio communications. Mass manpower was replaced by mass firepower. This type of warfare was used in World War I, where it was fought on the borders where soldiers met soldiers on the battlefield. Third generation warfare. The focus was on using speed and surprise to bypass enemy lines, and in doing so collapse their forces from the rear. This was more about trying to outmaneuver your enemy, and there was no face-to-face battles. It's where we have the introduction of tanks, aircrafts and air carriers, and it was mainly deployed in World War II when you had things like the Blitzkrieg lightning strikes. Wars were fought within countries and on the urban streets. This moved to the Cold War period in the 50s, 60s and 70s, where it became communism versus capitalism and the threat of nuclear exchange. Fourth generation warfare. This is the most difficult to define thus far because it contains various elements of different levels of sophistication. The gist, however, is to blur the lines between war and politics and combatants and civilians. In other words, a country goes to war with another country without actually directly attacking that country from the start. Instead, they attack the ideology, culture and social values of a country by using psychological warfare, disinformation and mass media manipulation. Normal armies don't go in and attack. Instead, the country is softened up by use of things like sanctions, political and economic collapse, and supporting violent groups and insurgencies, and orchestrating sectarian, religious and ethnic wars so a country implodes from within. Once the damage has been done eternally, the country is no longer able to resist a foreign invasion. A country then is either dismembered or the foreign invader occupies the land and installs their own puppet government or regime. The perfect example to demonstrate this type of warfare is what happened with Iraq. You see, Iraq's trade and economy was impacted first because of sanctions placed upon the country itself. The media around the world was then used to manipulate people into believing that there were chemical weapons of mass destruction inside Iraq, and that Saddam Hussein was a grave threat because he was going to use these weapons of mass destruction. And at the same time, insurgent groups were funded and supported to fight each other on the grounds of sectarianism. In other words, you had Sunnis versus Shias. And so when the country was on the brink of collapse, they sent in the foreign troops, they sent in the foreign invasion, and there was absolutely no resistance whatsoever. And if you remember back at the time, you know, I vividly remember, I think it was the Iraqi foreign minister, and you know, he was on TV and he was talking about how the Americans were being slaughtered and how the Iraqis were winning the war. And it was one of the most bizarre statements, because literally after a few hours, or I think it was a few days, basically in a very short period of time, the entire Iraqi government collapsed. In other words, there really wasn't a war, there was no resistance whatsoever. The country literally imploded as soon as the Americans really went in. And that only happened because the damage was already done because of the things that I just mentioned. And of course, there were never any weapons of mass destruction. Another example for your research is Yugoslavia, which was a massive state, but then it got broken up into 5 smaller states using this tactic of 4th generation warfare. 5th generation warfare. This is where there is a war without a war, or at least a traditional war. In other words, it's a war of perception and controlling the narrative, whereby they deliberately create incidents and flashpoints to help control the public narrative. Think of it as information and propaganda war on steroids. The battlefield is the media, and obviously a large part of that today is social media. The aim is to keep people divided, angry, and attacking each other. And it's so smart because it allows civilians to destroy each other without directly fighting. Think Republican versus Democrat, think BLM, think feminism versus masculinity, Israel, Palestine, vaxxer, anti-vaxxer, and all of the other shit that keeps flaring up every other day now, it seems, or at least definitely every other week. Because we have this woke cancel culture where there's shit to be angry about every other day. And it goes from serious issues like Israel versus Palestine to absolutely stupid issues like, you know, taking offense to the picture of the Queen being removed from a university. The point here is to keep people stressed, anxious, angry, divided, and always fighting and arguing with each other. By keeping people fearful and creating a panic, you can then bring in solutions which basically erode away the freedoms of people. And whilst these freedoms are being eroded, there is absolutely no resistance whatsoever, because people are too occupied arguing and fighting and being fearful and stressed about every crap news that's being deliberately spun out. So what you have are people and agents, however you want to define them, some willingly but most without realizing, are dispatched against their own country and against their own people. And this is why unanimously around the world right now you have people that are attacking their own culture, their own religion, their own states, their own countries, their own people. Institutions within countries basically go to war with each other. For example, the judiciary, the media, the civil and military leadership all seem to be going against each other. And you also have a lot of terrorist proxy groups, the main ones being groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda. But even the smaller groups are infiltrated, like BLM and Antifa and practically every other social justice warrior group. You know, they may start off as legitimate, but eventually they will get compromised and they will be used to control the narrative and for a hidden agenda. And like I said earlier, a lot of these people will not realize that they are being used, they are being manipulated, and they may genuinely think that they are fighting a just cause. And with their intention and their actions may be legitimate, but they are oblivious to the fact that they are being used for a different purpose. And like I said, it includes the smaller groups within countries, and on the grand scale it's more serious in terms of religious and sectarian wars. Instead of fourth generation warfare, where you have a civil war imploding a state, fifth generation warfare aims to attack entire regions instead. Think in terms of the Middle East as a whole, think of Southeast Asia like Pakistan and Afghanistan, think of South America rather than individual countries. The aim is to burn everything, annihilate the whole region rather than individual states, so that there's no military threat left standing to go against you. Instead, you practically have headless states where anarchy starts to run wild. This now brings us to sixth generation warfare. It's still similar to the previous generations, but then on steroids, and then there's the introduction of biochemical and biomedical warfare, as well as cyber attacks which seek to disrupt the supply chain, energy and general way of life. Here the goal is to bring a total economic collapse, hardship and famine. Why would they want to do that? Well, because it then paves the way for a great global reset. It paves the way for a new world war, which will then pave the way for a new world order. Now I know what you're thinking, just because I've used those words, this is just conspiracy theory, but I ask you to just take the look at the world around you right now. Take all of the different pieces of the jigsaw puzzle and put them together. Look at the news not as isolated incidents, but as different pieces of the puzzle, and when you start to bring them together, you start to see a picture emerging. Think about it. What do we have news about today which would have been unthinkable quite some time ago? Artificial meat, power grids down, the terrible impact humans are having on the environment, on animals, on wildlife, and then you've got all of this news about carbon control and climate change, and that's on top of all the pandemic and all the wars and the hysteria and the flooding and everything else that seems to be going off right now. There are just so many problems all around the world, and nobody is exempt. And if you study business and entrepreneurship, you'll know that problems is in fact a good thing for profit, because it enables you to then provide solutions. And what are these solutions being proposed for the problems that we've just talked about? Yes, we need to reduce industrial tasks, we need to reduce jobs, reduce the population, reduce animals, and replace them with artificial meat and AI. Essentially, they're ushering in a new world which is going to be controlled by technology and AI, and this is where blockchain comes in. If you haven't studied blockchain, I would implore you to do so, because the technology, yes, it has the potential to change the world in a good way, but so did nuclear energy. But what was nuclear energy used for instead? It was used to create the nuclear bomb. And just as that happened, the same thing can potentially happen with blockchain technology, where it's used against the people instead. And blockchain technology is directly linked to the soon-to-be digital passports, which are currently being rolled out and programmed as vaccine passports. Think also of the VR and AR technology. I think recently Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, released the technology where you put on VR headsets, and then you can communicate with other people and it looks like you're in this virtual world. And that really does emphasize the point, because what we're going to have is this cyber and biological world integration. And if you are a 90s movie fan, you will be aware obviously of the Matrix. I mean, if you're not aware of the Matrix, well, I don't know where you're living or what rock you're living under, but essentially what we have is forcing everyone inside a matrix of a kind. Ultimately, we're getting to a stage where you can measure body temperature, you can regulate emotions, and even download thoughts and memories. Does that seem far-fetched? Well, isn't it already happening? Let me ask you another question. Do you feel in control of your emotions right now, or do you feel you are losing control of your emotions more often than you should? You know, how often do you actually get triggered by all of the news stories that are being forced out on you right now? Whether it's Israel versus Palestine, whether it's vaxxer versus anti-vaxxer, whether it's women getting raped and assaulted, whether it's police brutality and racism. Think back to the last 6 weeks and the last 6 months. How many news stories have blown up on the news and absolutely enraged you? Like, how many times have you been triggered and angered and stressed by what you've seen and heard on both the mainstream news and on social media? And also, just take a moment to think how much of your information is already in your smartphones. How many pictures have you taken, even though you might not have posted them on social media, as the recent Apple thing where they're allowed to scan pictures shows. They can see your pictures that are just on your phone and not on social media. Like, how many pictures have you taken, how many videos have you created, which will eventually be able to be scanned by AI. Not only can AI scan, but they can replicate and inspect. We saw some cool technology not too long ago where you have the Tom Cruise deep fakes. Yeah, that technology is cool, but just imagine that the photos and the videos that you've put on your phone, those photos can be taken and plastered onto whatever they want as a deep fake, and nobody will be any wiser about what's really going on. I mean, some of you are absolutely dumb enough to activate fingerprint technology on your phones, and I have absolutely no words whatsoever for those that activated eye scan technology on their phones. But then what is the grand plan? Why would they be doing all of this? Well, it's simple. People have been trying to tell you for decades, whether it's truth speakers, whether it's scientists that get blocked off, whether it's politicians that get shot, or whether it's authors who write storybooks. It's about systematic control, surveillance, and monitoring of every aspect of your life. And it's about having total and full control of the supply chain and power grid. I mean, they practically already have control of the power grid and supply chains, and in terms of the total surveillance, you only need to look at what's going on in China. This technology already exists. This plan has already been put into motion. So just think about this for a second. What happens if tomorrow the power grid goes off and the supermarket shelves become empty and the water gets turned off? Where will you go to get food and water from? Do you even know how to grow your own food? Do you have access to people who grow their own food, or are you reliant on the system, which could be shut down with a click of a finger? In other words, you have already given up this power. And there is another element, which is weaponized weather. Oh, you thought HARP was a conspiracy theory? Oh, but at the same time, you're so impressed with Dubai creating fake rain? Come off it. I mean, soon I won't be surprised if there is a fake alien invasion. Just take a step back to think and take a broader look at the world right now. What do you increasingly have thrown in your face? Transhumanism, gender neutrality, loss of identity, purpose and meaning? and you've got idiots that are basically scanning their QR codes on themselves like tattoos, what does that remind you of? It's just cattle. Humans becoming cattle ready for the slaughter. But the point is, we now live in a time where there is so much deception, there are so many lies, there are so many proxy groups, there are so many ill intent people, there are so many confused people that it's no longer enough to draw conclusions based upon labels alone. It's no longer a war between Islam and Jews and Christians, etc. It's no longer a war between the US and Russia and China. This is now an entirely different beast altogether. The battle lines have been drawn, but they are blurred as fuck. Put it bluntly, you're going to have two sides of the war, and one side is going to contain Muslims, Jews, Christians, atheists, Hindus, Sikhs, and everyone else. Whilst on the other side, you're going to have Jews, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, Sikhs, atheists, and everyone else. Labels just don't mean anything anymore, and you've got to put them to one side. Instead, build bridges, alliances, and relationships with people based purely on their character and conduct. Because unfortunately, seeing is no longer believing. Today, seeing is deceiving. And this is where you must develop spiritual insight, intuition, and a third eye, sixth sense. The foundation of human unity is that we are spiritual in nature. Stick to this foundation like glue and avoid anyone that tries to break it and sow discord and disunity. Create local groups and local communities, or join online groups and online communities where you have like-minded people together. I just want to give credit to where credit is due. A lot of the information about 4th, 5th and 6th generation warfare that I talked about in this video came from a defense analyst by the name of Zaid Hamid. Check out his channel because he explains it a lot better than I do. If you liked the contents of this video, please give it a thumbs up, share it, and share your thoughts in the comments below. And please hit the subscribe button so you get more content, because in the next video I'm going to be talking about recent history and the real purpose, or one of the other hidden purposes, of World War I and World War II. Until the next video, take care, bye bye.